Growing up in a small town meant a lot of regulars. Places, routines, people. The gas station convenience store was a small microcosm of that greater regular. 6 a.m., Bill Dunner stopped in on his way to the slaughterhouse for cigarettes and a pack of powdered donuts. 7:15, the bus stop kids huddled around the magazine rack looking for the latest swimsuit edition. 8:30, Dr. Mangan pulled up for a coffee to go and a copy of that day's paper. I was used to all of them, knew their names, their families, where they lived and worked. They made the mornings simple, regular. The evening shift was a bit less predictable, seeing more folks who were just passing through with the exception of Earl. If there was one man routine was made for, it was him. Earl was a tall fella, easily over 6 feet, and he had the leathery tanned skin of a laborer that contrasted with his straw-colored hair and pale eyes. Despite his size, people took to calling him Mouse sometimes, on account of how quiet he was, except for the occasional grunt. He didn't speak. Never had. He had a way of sneaking up on you so you didn't know that he was there till he tapped you on the shoulder. Anyone new to town said they found him off, and creepy, even. What with his habit of staring with that crooked smile of his. Truth was, a head injury as a baby had just left him slow, was all. If you gave him time, he could write out simple words and used gestures well enough to get his point across. He worked odd handyman jobs around town and lived alone out by the swamp in the house his parents had left him, but otherwise, I didn't know a whole lot about him. Except for how much he loved our pre-wrapped sandwiches, a cold Coke, and a Hershey bar. Came in for them every night, $5.50 on the nose. Would nod towards the cashier on his way in, walk to the shelves for the items, then lay them down with a reverent kind of care at the register. I saw him at least 3 times a week, depending on his scheduling. "Doing okay, Earl?" I asked. He'd bob his head once, maintaining a steady eye contact while he did. Even with a smile, or maybe because of it, it could be a bit unnerving. Or he'd keep you in his gaze like that, and you never quite knew what he was thinking. I'd give him his total, always the same. And he'd painstakingly count out his dollars and coins, pushing them one by one across the counter to me with the tip of his pointer finger. He never wanted a bag, preferring to carry his things against his chest to his old pickup truck. The thing was held together by the paint chips and rust, but as he climbed in, he'd pat the roof affectionately, like he was thanking it for still running. Same thing. Every day, pretty much down to the minute. Momentary discomfort aside, I didn't think Earl was dangerous or anything. Just a bit different. And then, one evening he missed his usual visit. I only noticed when it came time to clock out at 8 that I hadn't seen him. And even then it was only a passing thought that hardly lasted a minute. I was too busy looking forward to getting home and settling into a nice hot bath. Made it about halfway down the quiet country lane towards my house when I noticed the beat-up truck sitting at the side of the road in dusk's fading light. The headlights fell on Earl leaning against the tailgate, his face all wrinkled up with worry, and there was something so childlike in that expression that I had to pull off behind him. "You doing okay, Earl?" For the first time, he shook his head and pointed helplessly at his truck. I squeezed my steering wheel and sighed. I wasn't in the habit of giving near strangers rides, but I just couldn't leave him there. It was clear that he was in distress, especially now when I knew the town's only tow truck was out of commission while Dave was on his vacation. "You live out in Cedarwood, right?" I asked. He perked up and nodded. "Well, it's a little out of my way, but well, I could give you a lift home if you want." He was already coming towards me before I'd even finished making the offer. The car seemed to shrink with Earl inside it. Even folded up like he was, he took up a lot of space. I leaned away towards the door and was only slightly aware that I was going faster than usual once we got on the road again. My passenger stared straight ahead, hands on his knees, quiet. I thought about trying to fill the silence with small talk, but decided against it in favor of the radio. Not like Earl could have answered anyway. The turnoff to his place was hidden between trees, hung with thick Spanish moss. Crickets and frogs sang from the swamp behind his house, a two-story that had started to sag with age. Old car parts, tools, and debris littered his overgrown yard. It was exactly the kind of place I'd imagined for him. All right, Earl, here you go. You got a phone so you can call around about, I stopped short, embarrassed. Of course, he couldn't make phone calls. He stared at me and smiled. I could, make a call for you, I guess? I offered, although I wasn't exactly thrilled to do so. You want me to call the sheriff, let him know about your truck? He nodded and motioned for me to follow. Oh, you want me to call right now? Another nod. I sucked in air through my teeth, and I gave a subtle look around. He really did live out in the middle of nowhere, didn't he? He tapped my forearm with a fingertip and inclined his head towards the dark house. Yeah, okay, I finally said, and climbed out of the car with him. As we climbed the rickety porch steps, he held out an arm and pointed towards some holes eaten through the wood. When he was satisfied I wouldn't step in any, he crossed to the front door and held it open for me. I barely crossed the threshold before the smell hit me. Heavy, sick in its sweetness, stuck to everything. My dad had been an avid hunter when I was a little kid. The smell of death isn't one you forget, and Earl's house reeked of it. My stomach flipped inside out, suddenly screaming at me that something was very wrong here. I threw my arms over my nose and turned to find the doorway blocked by his large frame. He was still smiling and waving for me to go further into his stinking house. With my nearest exit blocked, I shuffled reluctantly forward. The floorboards groaned with each step. Earl flicked on a light, dim but enough to chase back the worst of the dark. I was trying hard to only breathe through my mouth, although the stench was bad enough to coat my tongue. I was all too aware of how close Earl was. There was nothing mouse-like about him in that moment. The narrow hallway in front of us, half taken up by the staircase, branched off into 3 rooms. Earl gestured towards the nearest one and then put his hand against his ear like a phone. He stayed on my heels as I walked toward it. The smell was getting worse. The light came on. An old phone sat on the side table next to a lumpy couch, its brown floral fabric covered in stains, and lying upon it, her flesh, shrunken and mottled, her dark hair matted into clumps, was the decaying remains of a young woman. My scream startled Earl, who stepped back, and I took advantage of his surprise. I darted past him, shrieking, and ran for the front door. His footsteps seemed to shake the whole house as he chased after me, making a guttural grunting sound as he did. I threw the door closed as hard as I could as I went through, but he stopped it from closing with a meaty outstretched hand. I made it into my car only seconds before he reached it, and frantically slapped the lock into place. Earl crouched, his heavy forehead pulled into a frown, tapped his fingers hard against the window. I jammed my keys into the ignition, set it in reverse, and pressed hard on the gas, setting my car shooting backwards. Earl made a brief attempt to follow, banging once more on my hood, but I kept going until I was all the way out to the road, where I spun towards town. The drive to the police station was the longest I'd ever made. A search of Earl's house turned up 3 more women inside. They had died anywhere from weeks to months before, based on their various states of decomposition. He was immediately brought in for questioning, but the sheriff told me Earl was crying too hard to answer any. I thought it was guilt at being caught, maybe fear over what was going to happen next. The sheriff, however, said that he was more like a child who didn't understand what was going on. They put him in a cell, where he eventually cried himself to sleep. The next day, Dr. Mangan, who'd been everyone's physician for the last 3 decades, was brought in. They thought having someone Earl was comfortable with would help with the interrogation. It lasted for hours, after which I was told what he said. They asked if he killed the girls. He shook his head. They asked how'd they come to be in his house then. He'd written out that he'd found them already asleep. Where? In the swamp. How? With the same painstaking care Earl used to count his money, he'd written, I heard them. Impressed for what he meant, he dragged his finger like tears down his cheeks. Crying. And then he was asked why he brought them to his house. They wanted to go home. I took them. I helped. They stopped crying and have good sleeps. I helped. Do you believe him? I asked the sheriff after he'd finished updating me. He was quiet for a moment and then said, I think I do. So what happens now? A full investigation, maybe a trial. Or we'll stay in jail while we figured it out. Good, I muttered. And to my surprise, the sheriff shook his head. How is it not? You've got him. I have a man in custody who thinks he helped already dead women have good sleep. And maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think that he had anything to do with their deaths. My gut says he didn't. And you know what that means? No? That the person who did kill them, he's still on the loose. And now, there's no one out there to hear their cries. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and thank you so much for listening to tonight's story, or watching tonight's story, whichever one you happen to do. I also want to tell you, if you guys like stories, then you should always check out the description down below. In the description, there's a couple different places you can always go to if you like stories. There's always books from new authors that I will feature at the beginning of the episodes, and the links are in the description, or there's my books. You can check out the Creepypasta Collection Volume 1 and Volume 2, and they're linked in the description down below, and they come from some of the greatest authors I've worked with throughout the entirety of my career. Especially, I wanted to give a big thank you to Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Mr. Thud, Ken Lando Higuchi, Chompski, Bobby Karman, Nico kaeo, Tristain Pelton, Chase Burnett, Deanna Kraus, King Hades F13, Unknown Nobody, Joshua Mcmeekin, Michael Scharbrough, Kazan, ThisIsMyRealNameNoShit, Jason VB Wilson, InfernalOne, Lilwulfgaming, JimboTheHutt, Caspian, Jordan Nells, Hades' nephew, Jordan Wayne Deckard, Brandy Lipe, Ann Sharon, Acid System, Mike Bullock, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Brian Ark, Cryptic Nightmares, Shadow Morningstar, Someone You Love, S-Man, Kieran the Sloth, Thomas Burgett, Liam Newman, Sky Harbor, Caleb Dougal, Nina Smith, Rafael Rodriguez, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Daniel Paulson, and Corey X. Kenshin. Thank you guys so much for being supporters on Patreon. You guys are seriously the MVPs, as well as everybody who's listed down there in the description down below. I hope all of you have enjoyed the stories with me, and sweet dreams.